We've got the beginnings of our table put together inside the request index component. We now need to think about starting to get our list of requests rendered inside of here as well. Now I think that there's going to end up being a decent amount of logic tied to each row or each request inside of this component. So I'm thinking that rather than placing all the logic for rendering one individual row into our request index component, we should instead make a new component, something called like request row. And that thing will have a better idea of how to render one individual row, and it will also contain some helper methods for handling a user clicking on either the approve or finalize buttons. So we're going to make a separate component right now. The entire purpose of this component is going to be to render out one individual row. So let's start by making that new component inside of our components directory. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my components directory, and inside there I'll make a new file called requestrow.js. And then inside of here, I'll put together a little bit of dummy logic for a simple React component right now. At the top, we will import React and component from React. I'll create a new component called requestRow, and then I'll define a render method that just returns a div for right now. And I'll just give it the text request, like so. Then at the bottom, we'll export default request row. Let's make sure that we now import this into our request index component, and then we'll iterate through our list of requests and render one of these for every request that we have. So back inside of our index.js file, I'll go back up to the top where we'll add an import statement for our request row component. We'll do .. components request row. Okay, that's looking good. So we've now got this component inside of here. Now we'll add a helper method to render one of these for every request that we've loaded up and fetched from our campaign. And we'll call that helper method from inside of our render method right here. So I'm going to make a helper method called render row. Inside of here, we will iterate over our list of requests. And for every request, we will return a new request row. All right, so I'm going to return this .props.request, or just requests. We'll map over that. We're going to pass an arrow function to this that gets called with every request and the index of each request as well. And then inside of here, we will return one new request row. The request row component right here is probably going to need a couple of different props so that it understands exactly what request it's trying to render on the screen. So I'm going to give this thing a couple different props. First off, I'm going to make sure I pass in the request that I want it to render. So that will be request, which is coming from this inner mapping function right here. I'm going to make sure that I also pass in a key property as well. And remember that a key property is a part of React. React wants us to always pass in a key whenever we are rendering a list of components. And then finally, I think that we probably will also need to pass in the address of the current campaign that we are working on as well. So we'll add in a prop of address, and I'll pass to it this .props.address, like so. Okay, I think that's good for right now. Now, last thing I want to do is make sure that I call render row from inside of our render method. Now, render row is going to eventually form kind of like the backbone of the body of our table. So all the individual rows that you see right here. As a quick reminder, Semantic UI expects that we'll place all of our different rows inside of a body element. So I do need to make sure that I first place a table.body, and then we can call render rows from inside of that. And we just need to make sure that render rows eventually returns a table.row that contains a bunch of table.cells. But that's going to be some JSX that we return from our from our request row component. All right, so down inside of my render method, but still inside of my table. So notice how I'm inside of table right now. I'm going to place a body tag. So this body tag right here that I'm placing, you'll recall we destructured off of table just a moment ago. So here's the body tag right here. Then inside the body, we can call this dot render rows, like so. All right, so we might get an error message right now because we are trying to render a div inside of this body tag right here, but let's at least flip over to our browser and see if anything shows up at all. So back inside my browser, oh, okay, I think I might have mislabeled that function. I called render rows right here. And what did I actually call it when I render row? All right, my mistake, not render row right here. I want render rows. All right, so I'll save that and let's try again. All right, that's better. Okay, so it looks like maybe I get an error, maybe I don't. Yep, I definitely got an error message here because I'm trying to display a div inside of a table body. Like I said, we'll fix that up in just a moment. But at least for right now, I can verify that I'm displaying a request on the screen. And this request is supposed to represent one individual request coming from our campaign. So let's come back to the next video, and we're gonna kind of do a little bit of enhancement to our request row component and make sure that it displays on the screen a lot more like how our mock-up over here displays it. So quick pause, and we'll take care of that in the next video.